The bullet hit the dirt 3 inches from where the dog cowered, and Wade Garrison did not flinch as he fired a second shot that sent the mangy creature yelping into the desert scrub beyond the edge of Las Vegas, Nevada. It was August of 1883, and the heat shimmered off the dusty streets like water, but Wade felt nothing except the familiar coldness that had settled in his chest years ago. He holstered his revolver with practiced ease and turned back toward the saloon, ignoring the wide-eyed stares of the townsfolk who had witnessed yet another display of his cruelty. They called him the meanest cowboy in Lincoln County, and he wore that reputation like armor, never once showing softness or mercy to man or beast. Julia Foster watched from the window of her father's general store, her hands gripping the wooden frame so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had arrived in Las Vegas just 2 weeks prior, sent by her aunt in Philadelphia after her parents had died of scarlet fever. At 21 years old, Julia had expected to find some semblance of civilization in Nevada, but what she found instead was a town ruled by fear and violence, where men like Wade Garrison dictated the terms of survival. She had seen him nearly every day since her arrival, always dressed in black, his hat pulled low over eyes that never seemed to reflect any warmth. He was perhaps 24 or 25, tall and broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked carved from granite and a mouth that never smiled. "Stay away from that one," her Uncle Samuel had warned her on her first day. "Wade Garrison ain't got a kind bone in his body, lost his family to Comanche raiders when he was just a boy, and something inside him died right along with them. He works the ranches around here, best wrangler in 3 counties, but he treats people worse than he treats the horses." Julia had nodded, but she could not stop watching him. There was something about the way he moved through the world, as if he were always bracing for the next blow, that made her heart ache in a way she did not fully understand. She had seen him shove an old prospector out of his way at the saloon, watched him curse at children who got too close to his horse, heard him reduce a store clerk to tears over a minor mistake in his supply order. Everyone gave him a wide berth, and he seemed to prefer it that way. The days passed in a rhythm of heat and dust. Julia helped her uncle in the store, learning the names of the regulars, getting accustomed to the rough ways of the frontier. She served cowboys and miners, dance hall girls and respectable wives, and slowly the town began to feel less foreign. But Wade remained a dark constant, appearing like a storm cloud whenever she least expected it. He would stride into the store, bark his orders at her uncle, throw his money on the counter, and leave without a word of thanks. His eyes would slide over Julia as if she were part of the furniture, nothing worth noticing or acknowledging. One evening in early September, Julia was closing up the store alone. Her uncle had ridden out to a nearby ranch to deliver supplies and would not return until morning. She was sweeping the front porch when she heard the thunder of hooves and looked up to see Wade riding hard down the main street. His horse was lathered with sweat, and even in the fading light, Julia could see that something was wrong. Wade's shoulders were rigid, his jaw clenched, and he rode past the saloon without stopping, heading instead toward the old mission church at the far end of town. Julia told herself it was none of her business. She should finish her work, lock up, and go upstairs to the small room where she slept. But her feet seemed to move of their own accord, carrying her down the street in the direction Wade had gone. The church was abandoned most days, used only on Sundays when the circuit preacher came through. Julia approached quietly, her heart hammering in her chest, not sure what she would find or why she even cared. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, she could see Wade kneeling in one of the pews near the front. His hat lay on the bench beside him, and his head was bowed. For a moment, Julia thought he might be praying, but then she heard it, a sound so unexpected it froze her in place. Wade Garrison was crying, not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. His hands gripped the back of the pew in front of him, and his shoulders heaved with the force of his grief. Julia's first instinct was to flee, to give him privacy, but something rooted her to the spot. She had never seen anyone cry like that, with such complete abandonment of pride or pretense. It was raw and painful, and it made Wade seem suddenly, startlingly human. She stood there in the doorway, her own eyes filling with tears in response, and before she could stop herself, she pushed the door open wider. The creak of the hinges cut through Wade's sobs like a knife. His head snapped up, and his red-rimmed eyes met hers across the empty church. For a moment, neither of them moved. Julia saw the shock on his face transform into something darker, shame mixed with fury, and she knew she had trespassed on something sacred and private. "Get out," he said, his voice hoarse and broken, but Julia did not move. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I did not mean to intrude. I only wanted to make sure you were all right." "All right," Wade laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "You think I am all right." He stood up abruptly, wiping at his face with the back of his hand. "This ain't your concern, Miss Foster. Go back to your store." "My uncle told me about your family," Julia said softly, taking a small step forward. "About what happened to them. I lost my parents this year. I know what it feels like to have that kind of emptiness inside you." Wade's face contorted, and for a moment, Julia thought he might yell at her, might order her out with violence if necessary. But instead, his shoulders sagged, and he sank back down onto the pew. "Today is the anniversary," he said quietly. 15 years since I watched them die. Since I hid like a coward while the Comanche burned our homestead and killed everyone I loved. I was 9 years old and I did nothing. Julia moved down the aisle until she stood beside his pew. "You were a child." "What could you have done?" "I could have died with them," Wade said flatly. "Instead, I lived, and every year on this day I remember that I am a coward who saved his own skin." "That is not cowardice," Julia said, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. "That is survival. Your parents would have wanted you to live." Wade looked up at her, and something in his expression shifted. He seemed to really see her for the first time, this young woman with dark hair and gray eyes who looked at him without fear or judgment. "Why do you care?" he asked. "I have never been anything but cruel to you and everyone else in this town." "I do not know," Julia admitted, "but I do care, and I think maybe you have been cruel because it hurts less than being kind." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Finally, Wade stood up and retrieved his hat. "Thank you," he said stiffly, "for not running away, for not treating me like a monster." "You are not a monster," Julia said. "You are just a man who has been hurt." Wade nodded once sharply and then walked past her toward the door. But before he left, he paused and looked back. "I am sorry," he said, "for being the way I am, for making this town afraid of me." "Then change," Julia said simply. "It is never too late to be different." The next morning, Julia woke to find a bouquet of wildflowers on the store's front porch. There was no note, but she knew who had left them. Throughout the day, she caught glimpses of Wade around town, and each time she noticed small changes. He helped an old woman carry her parcels to her wagon. He stopped to let a group of children cross the street in front of his horse. When he came into the store that afternoon, he actually looked at Julia when he placed his order, and his voice, though still gruff, held a note of politeness. "Thank you, Miss Foster," he said when she handed him his supplies. "You are welcome, Mr. Garrison," she replied, and the smile she gave him was genuine. Over the following weeks, the transformation in Wade became more pronounced. It was as if seeing him cry had broken something open inside him. Or perhaps it had broken open something inside Julia that allowed her to see past his defenses. He began spending more time in town between ranch jobs, often finding reasons to stop by the general store. At first, his visits were brief and awkward, marked by stilted conversation and long silences. But gradually, he began to relax around her. One afternoon in late September, Wade arrived just as Julia was struggling to move a heavy barrel of flour. Without a word, he stepped forward and lifted it easily, carrying it to where she indicated. "Where is your uncle?" he asked. "Out making deliveries," Julia said. "He will be back tomorrow." Wade nodded and looked around the store as if searching for something else to do. "I could help you with the other heavy items," he offered, "if you need it." "I would appreciate that," Julia said warmly. They worked together for the next hour, and as they did, Wade began to talk. He told her about the ranch where he worked, about the horses he trained, about the vast stretches of Nevada desert that he knew better than any road map. Julia listened, fascinated by the passion that crept into his voice when he spoke about the land and the animals. This was a side of Wade that no one else in town had ever seen, and she felt privileged to witness it. "You really love it, don't you?" she said. "The ranching life." "It is the only thing that makes sense to me," Wade admitted. "Animals do not lie or betray you. They do not leave you unless you give them reason to. I reckon I understand horses better than I understand people." "Maybe you just never gave people a chance," Julia suggested gently. Wade looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "Maybe I never had a reason to," he said. "Until now." The air between them seemed to shift, becoming charged with something Julia could not quite name. Her heart beat faster and she found herself unable to look away from Wade's intense gaze. "Mr. Garrison," she began, but he interrupted her. "Wade," he said. "Please call me Wade." "Wade," Julia repeated, liking the way his name felt on her tongue. "I am glad you stopped by today." "So am I," Wade said, and for the first time since she had met him, Julia saw him smile. It was a small smile, tentative and unpracticed, but it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and infinitely more approachable. As October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the occasional rainstorm, Wade and Julia's friendship deepened into something more. He began calling on her properly, taking her for walks along the outskirts of town, always careful to maintain a respectful distance, but unable to hide the longing in his eyes. Julia found herself thinking about him constantly, replaying their conversations in her mind, imagining what it would be like if he kissed her. The rough cowboy who had once terrified the entire town now made her feel safer than she had ever felt in her life. The townspeople noticed the change in Wade and talked about it in hushed whispers. Some were skeptical, believing it was only a matter of time before his true nature reasserted itself. Others were cautiously optimistic, especially those who had known Wade before tragedy had hardened him. Julia's Uncle Samuel watched the developing romance with a careful eye, but he could not deny that Wade treated his niece with a gentleness that bordered on reverence. One evening in mid-October, Wade invited Julia to ride out with him to watch the sunset from a high ridge overlooking the valley. She accepted eagerly, and they rode side by side on horses Wade had borrowed from the ranch. The desert landscape spread out before them in shades of gold and purple, and when they reached the ridge, Wade helped Julia dismount with careful hands. "It is beautiful," Julia breathed, taking in the vast expanse of sky and land. "Yes," Wade agreed, but he was not looking at the sunset. He was looking at her. Julia turned to find him standing closer than propriety allowed, and her breath caught in her throat. "Wade," she whispered. "I need to tell you something," Wade said, his voice rough with emotion. I need you to know that you changed everything for me. That night in the church, when you saw me at my weakest and did not turn away, something inside me shifted. For 15 years, I have been living like a dead man, just going through the motions, not caring about anything or anyone. But you made me want to live again. You made me want to be better. You are better, Julia said, reaching up to touch his face. You are kind and thoughtful and so much stronger than you realize. Wade caught her hand in his, pressing it against his cheek. I am falling in love with you, Julia Foster, he said. I know I have no right to. No, I am not good enough for you, but I cannot help it. You are the light in my darkness. You have every right, Julia said, her eyes shining with tears. Because I am falling in love with you too, Wade Garrison. I have been since the moment I saw you cry. Wade pulled her into his arms then, holding her against his chest as if she were something precious and fragile. Julia could hear his heart pounding, could feel the tremor in his hands as they stroked her hair. When he finally tilted her chin up and kissed her, it was with a tenderness that made her knees weak. His lips were soft against hers, questioning rather than demanding, and Julia melted into him, wrapping her arms around his neck. They stood there on the ridge as the sun sank below the horizon, kissing and holding each other, whispering promises that felt as vast and enduring as the desert around them. Wade told her about his dreams of one day owning his own ranch, of raising horses and maybe a family. Julia told him about her love of books and learning, about how she had always felt like she did not quite fit in the refined world of Philadelphia, but had found something real and true here in Nevada. I want to court you properly, Wade said as they finally prepared to ride back to town. I want to ask your uncle for permission to see you want to do this right. He will say yes, Julia assured him. He has already told me he thinks you are a changed man. I am a changing man, Wade corrected, and it is all because of you. Samuel Foster did indeed give his permission, though not without a stern warning to Wade about what would happen if he hurt his niece. Wade took the warning seriously, vowing to Samuel and to himself that he would spend the rest of his life proving worthy of Julia's love. Through the rest of October and into November, their courtship continued, marked by stolen moments and long conversations that stretched late into the evening. Wade taught Julia to ride better, showing her the hidden corners of the desert that he loved. Julia introduced Wade to the world of books, reading aloud to him in the evenings when the store was closed. The town slowly adjusted to this new version of Wade Garrison. Children no longer ran from him in the streets. Women greeted him politely at church. Men began to seek his advice on horse training and ranch work, finding him patient and knowledgeable rather than cruel and dismissive. It was as if Julia had unlocked something in him that had been buried for 15 years, and now that it was free, Wade could not imagine going back to the way he had been. In December, a harsh winter storm swept through Nevada, bringing snow and ice that made travel nearly impossible. Wade, who had been working at a ranch 15 miles from town, fought his way back through the blizzard because he could not bear the thought of Julia worrying about him. He arrived half frozen, his lips blue and his hands numb, and Julia pulled him inside the store, wrapping him in blankets and pressing hot coffee into his hands. You could have died out there, she scolded, even as tears of relief streamed down her face. You should have stayed at the ranch until the storm passed. I could not stay away from you, Wade said through chattering teeth. I needed to know you were safe. Julia kissed him then, heedless of her uncle's presence in the next room, pouring all her fear and love into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, Wade was looking at her with such intensity that she felt it like a physical touch. Marry me, he said. It was not a question but a statement of intent, a declaration of everything he felt. I know we have not been courting long, but I know my heart. I want to spend every day of the rest of my life making you happy, keeping you safe, being the man you see when you look at me. Marry me, Julia." "Yes," Julia said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They were wed in the old mission church in late January of 1884, with half the town in attendance. Julia wore a simple dress of white linen that her aunt had sent from Philadelphia, and Wade wore a new suit that he had purchased specially for the occasion. When the circuit preacher pronounced them man and wife, Wade kissed Julia with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The reception was held at the saloon, which had been cleaned and decorated for the event, and for the first time in years, Wade Garrison laughed freely, his arm around his new wife, his face transformed by joy. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a modest two-room structure that Wade promised to expand as soon as he saved enough money. Julia did not care about the size. She cared about the way Wade looked at her each morning as if he could not quite believe she was real, about the way he held her each night as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Their life together fell into a comfortable rhythm. Wade continued his ranch work, but now he came home each evening to a wife who greeted him with kisses and a warm meal. Julia continued helping at her uncle's store, but now she had a home of her own to care for, a husband to love. In the spring, Wade received word that a large tract of land northeast of Las Vegas was available for purchase at a reasonable price. He and Julia rode out to see it, and both fell in love with the rolling grassland dotted with juniper trees and crossed by a clear running creek. "This could be our ranch," Wade said, his voice filled with hope. "We could build something here, something that would last." "Then let us do it," Julia said, squeezing his hand. They spent the next 2 years building their dream. Wade worked harder than Julia had ever seen anyone work, rising before dawn and often not stopping until long after sunset. But he never forgot to be gentle with her, never slipped back into the cruelty that had once defined him. Julia worked alongside him, helping to string fences, caring for the first horses they purchased, turning their small ranch house into a home filled with warmth and love. By the summer of 1886, the Garrison Ranch was beginning to thrive, and Julia had news that would change everything. "I am with child," she told Wade one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "The doctor confirmed it today." Wade's face went through a series of emotions so quickly that Julia almost laughed. Shock, joy, fear, and finally a fierce protectiveness that made her heart swell. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am certain," Julia confirmed, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby, Wade." He pulled her into his arms then, and she felt wetness on her neck and realized he was crying. But these were not the tears of grief she had witnessed in the church all those years ago. These were tears of joy, of gratitude, of a man who had never expected to have a family of his own being given the greatest gift imaginable. "I will protect you both," Wade vowed. "I swear on everything I am, I will be a good father. I will be nothing like the angry, cruel man I used to be." "I know you will," Julia said, kissing away his tears. "You are already the best man I know." Their son was born in March of 1887, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes. They named him Thomas, after Wade's father, and the moment Wade held his son for the first time, Julia saw the last remnants of the old Wade Garrison disappear forever. He was completely, utterly in love with his child, and he approached fatherhood with the same gentleness he showed Julia. He would rock Thomas for hours, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice, telling stories about the land and the horses and the life they would build together. The town of Las Vegas had long since accepted that Wade Garrison was a changed man, but seeing him with his son removed any remaining doubts. Rough cowboys would stop by the ranch and find Wade lying on a blanket in the grass, letting Thomas crawl all over him, his face split by a wide grin. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid him now stopped him in town to coo over the baby and comment on what a devoted father he was. Wade took it all in stride, more concerned with his family's happiness than with what anyone else thought. As Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler, Julia and Wade's ranch continued to prosper. They added more land, more horses, and eventually hired a few ranch hands to help with the work. Wade had a reputation as a fair but exacting boss, someone who demanded hard work but rewarded it generously. He was especially patient with young men who reminded him of himself, those who had suffered loss and hardened themselves against the world. More than once, Julia watched him take aside a troubled ranch hand and talk quietly with him, offering the kind of understanding that could only come from someone who had walked that dark path. In 1890, Julia gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Caroline. If Wade had been smitten with Thomas, he was absolutely besotted with Caroline. She looked like Julia, with the same delicate features and bright eyes, and Wade treated her like a princess. Julia sometimes had to remind him not to spoil her too much, but she could not help but smile at the sight of her once mean cowboy husband being wrapped around his daughter's tiny finger. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved the horses as much as his father did. Caroline was bright and curious, always getting into mischief and making everyone laugh. Wade and Julia's love for each other only deepened with time, seasoned by the challenges they faced together and strengthened by their shared joys. On quiet evenings after the children were asleep, they would sit together on the porch, Wade's arm around Julia's shoulders, and talk about everything and nothing. "Do you ever think about who you used to be?" Julia asked him one night in the summer of 1894. Wade was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on her shoulder. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but it feels like remembering a different person, someone I used to know but am not anymore. That man was so full of pain and anger that he could not see any other way to be. He thought cruelty was strength and kindness was weakness." "What changed your mind?" Julia asked, even though she knew the answer. "You," Wade said simply. "You saw me at my absolute lowest when I had no defenses left, and instead of judging me or running away, you showed me compassion. You made me realize that I did not have to carry all that pain alone, that letting someone in did not make me weak. It made me stronger." "I love you," Julia said, tilting her face up to kiss him. "I love the man you were brave enough to become." "I love you too," Wade replied. "You are everything to me. You and the children. You are the family I thought I had lost forever." In 1896, they celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary with a large party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from all over the county, and the celebration lasted well into the night. Wade stood at one point and raised his glass, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I want to thank you all for coming," he said. "And I want to thank my wife, Julia, for taking a chance on a man who did not deserve her. 12 years ago, I was the meanest, most miserable person in this territory. I pushed everyone away and thought that was how life had to be. But Julia saw something in me worth saving, and she has spent every day since then showing me what it means to truly live. Everything good in my life, everything I am proud of, exists because of her. So here is to Julia, the woman who saved my life by seeing me cry and choosing to stay anyway." Julia's eyes filled with tears as the crowd cheered and raised their glasses. Wade came to her side and pulled her close, kissing her forehead as their children hugged their legs. In that moment, surrounded by love and friendship, Julia thought about that night in the church when she had seen a broken man sobbing alone. She thought about how scared she had been, how unsure, but how something had compelled her to reach out anyway. And she thought about how that one moment of compassion had changed both their lives forever. The ranch continued to grow and prosper through the late 1890s and into the new century. Thomas, now a teenager, worked alongside his father, learning everything Wade could teach him about ranching and horses. Caroline proved to have a head for numbers and helped Julia manage the ranch's accounts. In 1902, Julia and Wade welcomed a third child, another son they named Samuel after Julia's uncle, who had passed away peacefully the year before. Wade was 43 now, his dark hair shot through with silver, but he approached fatherhood for the third time with the same gentle enthusiasm he had shown with Thomas and Caroline. On a warm evening in May of 1904, Wade and Julia celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children had planned a surprise party, and the ranch was filled with people whose lives had been touched by the Garrison family. There were ranch hands who had found purpose working for Wade, neighbors who had been helped through hard times by the couple's generosity, children who had been taught to ride by Wade's patient instruction. As Julia looked around at the crowd, she marveled at how different their life was from what she might have expected that first day she saw Wade shoot at a dog in the street. Late that night, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Wade and Julia walked hand in hand to the top of the ridge where he had first told her he loved her. The view was the same as it had been 20 years ago, the desert stretching out endlessly beneath a star-filled sky. But everything else had changed. "You remember what I said to you here?" Wade asked, pulling Julia close. "You said I was the light in your darkness," Julia replied, resting her head against his chest. "You still are," Wade said. "Every single day. I think about the man I was before you, and it is like looking at a stranger. That man was so lost, so broken, and he did not even know how much he was hurting. But you saw past all that anger and cruelty. You saw that underneath it all was just a scared boy who had never healed from his wounds." "You did the hard work of healing," Julia said. "I just gave you a reason to try." "You gave me everything," Wade corrected. "A home, a family, a reason to be better. You know what the strangest thing is? I spent 15 years thinking that showing any vulnerability made me weak. I built walls so high that nobody could get close enough to hurt me again. But the moment you saw me cry, the moment I let those walls come down, that was when I became truly strong. Because loving you, raising our children, building this life together, that takes more courage than I ever needed to be cruel." Julia turned in his arms to face him, her hands cupping his weathered face. "You are the bravest man I know," she said, "and the kindest. And the man I will love until my last breath." Wade kissed her then, a kiss that held 20 years of love and devotion, of challenges overcome and joys shared. When they finally broke apart, both had tears streaming down their faces, but they were the good kind of tears, the kind that came from being so full of happiness that it overflowed. As they walked back to the ranch house, their arms around each other, Wade thought about the anniversary of his family's death, which had passed just a few months ago. For the first time in 36 years, he had not spent that day consumed by grief and guilt. Instead, he had spent it with Julia and their children, remembering his parents and siblings with love rather than pain, grateful for the years he had with them rather than tortured by the years he lost. It was yet another gift Julia had given him, the ability to hold both sorrow and joy in his heart without letting one destroy the other. The years continued to pass in contentment and purpose. Thomas married a sweet young woman from a neighboring ranch in 1908 and gave Wade and Julia their first grandchild, a boy named Wade Jr. Caroline went to school in Carson City and returned with a teaching certificate, opening a small school on the Garrison Ranch where she taught the children of ranch workers and nearby families. Samuel grew into a young man who combined his father's love of horses with his mother's love of learning, eventually studying veterinary medicine and returning to help care for the ranch's animals. In 1912, Wade and Julia celebrated their 28th anniversary quietly, just the two of them, at the old mission church where they had been married. The building was still used only occasionally, but it was kept in good repair by the community. They sat in the same pew where Julia had found Wade crying all those years ago, and he held her hand in the dim light filtering through the dusty windows. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you had not followed me that night," Wade said. "If you had just gone home and left me to my grief." "I think you would have found your way eventually," Julia said. "You have too good a heart to have stayed cruel forever." "I don't know about that," Wade said honestly. "I was so far gone, Julia. So buried in my own pain that I could not see anything else. I might have lived my whole life that way, alone and angry, pushing everyone away until I died as bitter as I lived. But you did not let that happen. You had the courage to step into my darkness and shine a light, and I followed that light out. I followed you. And I would follow you anywhere," Julia said, "through this life and whatever comes next." They renewed their vows there in that empty church, with no one to witness but themselves and the memories of their younger selves. Wade promised to continue loving Julia with the gentleness she had awakened in him. Julia promised to continue seeing the best in Wade, even when he struggled to see it himself. And when they left the church that day, walking hand in hand into the bright Nevada sunshine, they both knew that their love story was far from over. By 1915, the Garrison Ranch was one of the most respected in the territory. Wade was 61 years old, still strong and capable but happy to let Thomas take on more of the daily responsibilities. He spent his days working with the horses he loved, playing with his grandchildren, and sitting on the porch with Julia, watching the sun set over the land they had built together. The mean cowboy who had once terrorized Las Vegas, Nevada, was now remembered only in stories, a cautionary tale about how pain could twist a person and how love could heal them. Julia was 57, her dark hair now silver, her face lined with the marks of a life well lived. She still helped Caroline with the school, still managed the ranch's finances, still made sure everyone in their extended family felt loved and cared for. But her greatest joy was the quiet moments with Wade, when they could sit in comfortable silence or talk about everything that had happened since that night in the church, 32 years ago. One evening in late summer, as they watched their grandchildren play in the yard, Wade turned to Julia with a serious expression. "I need you to know something," he said. "Everything good in my life, every moment of happiness, every person I love, it all traces back to you. You saved me, Julia. Not just from loneliness or anger, but from myself. You showed me that it is never too late to change, never too late to become the person you were meant to be." "We saved each other," Julia corrected gently. "I was lost too when I came here. I had lost my parents, left behind everything familiar, arrived in a harsh land where I did not belong. But you gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to be brave, a love worth fighting for. We healed each other, Wade." Wade pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "Then I am grateful every day that you walked into that church," he said. That you saw me cry and did not turn away, that you loved me when I was unlovable. You were always lovable, Julia said firmly. You just needed someone to see it. They sat there as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, surrounded by the family they had built and the life they had created. The ranch stretched out around them, a testament to hard work and determination, but also to the power of compassion and love. Wade Garrison, once the meanest cowboy in Lincoln County, had become a man known for his kindness and integrity. And it had all started with a moment of vulnerability, with tears shed in an empty church, and a young woman brave enough to stay. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Julia rested her head on Wade's shoulder and smiled. She thought about all the years they had shared, all the challenges they had overcome, all the love they had given and received. She thought about the children they had raised and the grandchildren who carried on their legacy. And she thought about how one act of compassion had changed everything, had transformed not just two lives but an entire community. "I love you," Wade whispered into her hair. "More than words can say." "I love you too," Julia replied. "Always have, always will." And as they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the land they loved and the family they had built, Wade and Julia knew that their story had been worth every moment. The mean cowboy had learned to be gentle, the lonely girl had found her home, and together they had created a love that would endure long after they were gone. A love that had started with tears and grown into something beautiful and unbreakable.